Hello, this is S.K. Williams, and today I would like to talk to you about a great lie. It is a lie we tell as a society. A grand fiction that is all the more relevant today. And that grand fiction is that there are two great camps of humanity, the secular and the religious. Some people are religious and other people are not religious. And those who are religious follow religion, and those who are not religious are secularists. This mythos is actually used to understand various aspects of human society, but ultimately fails at actually helping people understand each other. Especially considering that we are told religion promotes certain specific traits in a person. Invariably, these traits are presented as something of a problem to solve. Most of them are simply bad traits, while of course being secular and not having a religion is generally presented as being free of those problems, or at the very least not being as susceptible to them. The problem is that there is no such thing as religion, and everyone is religious. That statement may sound contradictory, but it really isn't. Let me explain it to you this way. Most people on the planet have a nationality. There are a few that don't, but most do. However, no one's nationality is nationality, and no single nation or national identity that one can acquire can adequately explain, even in the most ardent patriot or the most dedicated nationalist or the most emphatic and zealous culturalist, lead us to conclude that all nationalities are inherently the same. And yet, this is exactly what we do with religion. If people are religious, they have the traits of a religious person, and they have the thought patterns of a religious person. And I would posit to you this. Religion is a category that we use to classify a type of thing, but it is not actually a thing in itself, and what we are classifying by the term religion is not altogether clear, because what fits in the religion category and what doesn't is largely arbitrary. It may be convenient to think if you believe a god exists, you are religious. Or at the very least, if you believe a god exists and worship said god, or you believe in gods and the supernatural, or something along those lines. But at the same time, even the people who insist that religion be understood as believing a god exists, or at least religion should be understood as inherently including belief in a god or gods and a belief in the supernatural, will often themselves violate that definition and include people who don't believe in the supernatural and don't believe in any gods. Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris, for example, as well as others who listen to them like Bill Maher, claim communism is a form of religion. And by communism we mean Marxist communism, the sort of communism that was practiced in the Soviet Union, the kind of communism that is still practiced today in China, where they embraced state atheism, where you could not be in the government unless you were an atheist, where you could not even work a government job unless you were an atheist. In the Soviet Union, They ridiculed religion in schools and told you why it was wrong and stupid and primitive. In the Soviet Union, they limited the freedom of speech of religious groups to certain specific areas. In the Soviet Union, persecution of religious groups was constant, and the only reason it ever lightened up from the early days of mass slaughter was because of the United Nations and because the eyes of the world were on the Soviet Union. You can hand me liberation theology if you want, claiming that it was a synthesis of Christian belief and Marxism, but liberation theology was not the rule of the day in the Soviet Union and is not the rule of the day in China. It is not what was practiced in Cuba. It is not practiced in Vietnam. The simple reality is this. Those who vilify religion will say they are not religious. They are atheists. They are agnostics. An atheist merely lacks belief in a god and has no belief system to share. Besides, as they lack belief in a god, they must lack religion, since by definition religion requires belief in a god. And yet, they have no qualms about calling other atheists religious, if they disapprove of them. Religion, as a distinct human enterprise, definable as separate from philosophy, or from science, or from art, or from government, or from other human affairs, is a thoroughly modern invention. And by modern, I meant it was created in the modern age, not that it was created as most would think of recent history. The concept actually traces back to John Locke, who, to be fair, was creating this definition for England for the government. Prior to the Protestant Reformation, though, the idea of religion as a privately held belief system that has communal aspects in that it is shared, but that is nevertheless primarily about the individual beliefs that one would hold. And the idea that, while it's hard to articulate because there is no uniform agreed upon definition, involves some sort of spirituality, is something that really didn't exist in antiquity. Please don't hand me the usual excuse of they just didn't have the word but they had the concept. And please don't tell me that when I say religion as a concept did not exist in the ancient world, that I am an idiot. I know the drill. I know that if I tell you the concept of religion did not exist until about the 1500s and as a product of the Protestant Reformation, and did not actually exist in antiquity or the Middle Ages, I will be ridiculed as an idiot and told that they had temples and gods aplenty. Much like if I tell you that religion doesn't exist today, people will tell me that there are churches on every street in America. The problem is that they're not really listening to what I'm saying. And when they do, it's only to scoff at me some more, rather than even admit they were wrong the first time. I'm not saying they didn't worship gods. I'm saying they had no concept of religion as we understand it. I'm not saying that they had the concept of religion, they just didn't have the word religion. They actually certainly did, at least by the time of the Roman Empire, since the word religion goes back to the Latin religiare and was certainly used. But they didn't have an idea of religion as distinct from philosophy, which is why Plato was not so much considered distinct from religious thinking by the Church Fathers, for example. The idea that religion is separate from these other things is more the product of modernism. And by modernism, I'm not talking about the philosophy of modernism. I'm talking about the modern history. Much as another concept we take for granted and assume has always existed, but really didn't, is a product of modernism. And that is the creation of the nation state. We tend to think in terms of nation states, and we tend to think of the ancient world as functioning along those same lines, but it really didn't. In the Middle Ages, for example, feudalism was the general rule of the day. And I say general rule of the day because there's no clear definition of what feudalism is, and no one actually sat down and created a political ideology called feudalism. And as much as it's vilified today, feudalism isn't what most people think it was. I'm not going to go into detail about that because this video is not about feudalism. But I will say this much about it. In the Middle Ages, they had no real concept of, my nation state is England and I am English by nationality. Or, my nation state is France and I am French by nationality. They had a concept of personal loyalties to your liege lord, to your fellows, and to your king. And there's even a story of a knight who has a fief in France, but who is also a man-at-arms to the English king. And when the English king goes to war with the French king, he orders his men-at-arms to actually help him on his attack. And this one says that he cannot, for he has taken his oath of fealty to both his king and to his lord, and he will not draw his sword against either master. This man was honored for keeping his word to both the King of France and to the King of England. And this was typical of feudal logic. It was not so much about which nation state you owe your loyalty to, and they don't necessarily think you must pick one. It was about whose friend you are. It is about who you swear fealty to. It was about a complex interlocking of relationships. And when a conflict of interest emerged, you may have to pick sides, or you may stay neutral. But it wasn't quite as clear-cut along national lines, and one may say it's not clear either, since someone can be born in one country but live in another and feel loyalty to both. But it's not the same, because in those cases you still have political concerns. Someone, for example, can leave a country and live many years in another country, and if a war breaks out, favor his old country, not for cultural reasons, but because he thinks the issues are right, or perhaps he favors his new one for purely political purposes. And after the war is over, a few years later, when the political issues are forgotten, he can still transmit himself back to the original country, even if he had fought against it, and is still considered part of it in general. There are, of course, complexities of life that may complicate that, but I'm talking about in a general principle. The rise of the nation-state occurred in the 1500s, and it occurred when people decided to draw primary authority and primary identity from a centralized government, the nation-state. It happened at the same time you saw the Protestant Reformation, and historians debate whether the shift toward nationalism caused the Reformation, or if the Reformation caused a shift toward nationalism, or if some other force caused both. But while I suppose you could argue it was coincidental, very few do. And it's obvious that certain ideas are very similar, thematically at least, between the two, and quite contrary to how people generally think of religion today. People's religious beliefs were never really encapsulated and separate from their mundane thoughts. This is why someone like Isaac Newton can believe in a determined universe, the same as John Calvin, even if he rejected many of Calvin's other beliefs. There are certain other aspects of belief that tie into it. This is also why I have a problem with the modern world's idea of Christian nationalism, because it's fairly obvious that a lot of what is being said about Christian nationalists is simply silly, and they're lumping in groups that are very diverse and aren't really working together in any conceivable way to attain any sort of goal, as if they are, and acting as if the beliefs they hold align with what their critics say they are. And this has actually happened before. The reason we look at fundamentalist religion badly is precisely because of the vilification that fundamentalists received in the early 20th century. Prior to the 20th century, the term fundamentalists didn't even exist, and really, prior to the late 19th century, nothing we could call fundamentalism existed. That may sound odd, since people would think that it definitely did, but it really didn't. And that's because fundamentalism has become rather like the word fascist. It's a word we apply to people we wish to vilify. People know fascists are bad, but people don't know what a fascist is, and there have been people explaining it, but most of those explanations are woefully inadequate. Indeed, you should probably check another channel out, Tick History, that points to the fact that it's actually not that hard to understand fascism. But what fascism really was contradicts the history that we are told to believe, and we want to believe, and the one that defines our identity in the modern era. And as such, a cognitive dissonance occurs, where people refuse to accept that fascism emerged from left-wing thought, because we prefer to believe it as a right-wing movement. But it is nevertheless a left-wing movement, or at the very least, draws from many more left-wing ideas than we are generally told. And the same thing happens with fundamentalism. In today's world, a fundamentalist is just a bad sort of religious person, and we assume violence and intolerance is inevitably connected to fundamentalism. But the only real trait that seems to be consistent, if not universal, to fundamentalism is that fundamentalists are intolerant, to the point of being willing to use violence, and that they are scriptural literalists. Which also leads to the unfortunate situation where if someone tells you they are biblical literalists, that means you know they are a fundamentalist, which means you are wary of them. Because after all, a fundamentalist Christian is dangerous. They are prone to violence, and at the very least they hate you and are intolerant of you. They believe the Bible literally. And the problem with that is that many people who are scriptural literalists aren't intolerant of people who don't share their religion. They aren't hostile. They aren't violent. However, the idea of what a fundamentalist is, as vague and as general as it is, itself permutated over the years. And the term actually goes back to a release of 4 books, which were actually collections of various tracts. The books were called The Fundamentals. In reality, they have a longer name, but you don't really need a longer one, not to understand the point I'm making. The primary editor of it was R.A. Torrey, who was himself the Chancellor of Moody Bible College later on. And when fundamentalism came out, it was ridiculed by people like Minchin. And the way it was ridiculed when it was about in the early 20th century, the 1910s, 1920s eras, was to deem it as anti-intellectual. And the idea that fundamentalists were anti-intellectual stuck. And gradually the mythos grew that fundamentalists were an anti-intellectual movement that rejected modernism, that arose due to conservative fears of a rapidly changing social order. And this radicalized them to an extent where they retreated within literalism and traditional religious faith and blocked out intellectual advances. This narrative is not actually true. If one were to sit down and read the fundamentals, which I have, one is actually greeted with intellectual thought, not anti-intellectual thought. And the fundamentalists are far from the raving madmen who are critical of change and only want to preserve the past. They are thoughtful men, and they do have insights that are valuable and worth reading. But we dismiss them as effectively a redneck hick who doesn't want the railroad through his town, or doesn't want the new highway, or doesn't want that thar internet. And over time, the term shifted from an anti-intellectual to a scriptural literalist willing to use violence and who is intolerant. And the idea being that all scriptural literalists are intolerant and violent. In reality, we're seeing the same thing happen. We have a bizarre historical narrative now. One in which we like to claim various things that are simply not true. For example, our modern idea of secularism. We like to claim that America's founding fathers were secularists, and they founded a secular country precisely because they feared a mixing of religion and politics, because looking at history and what was happening in Europe, they realized that every time you mix religion with politics, you end up with tyranny and oppression and wars. All they had to do was look at the Dark Ages and their centuries of the wars of religion that raged, and how they all fought over which one was the one true church, and how, when the church dominated, science, reason, and progress were outlawed as blasphemy and heresy, and how they were burning heretics and witches at the stake, and all of the manners of evil that we're used to, creating the 1,000-year period of stagnation in which all of the advanced knowledge of Greece and Rome were lost, and in which people lived in squalor, and their lives were, as Hobbes said, violent, brutish, and short. The idea being that if religion and government were mixed, religion would seize control and begin to implement its dogmas into law, and people who belong to other religions, or perhaps do not agree with the established church, would be vehemently persecuted, and either subject to exile, imprisonment, or execution. Hence why the Founding Fathers embraced secularism. And the problem with this narrative is that it is not true. For one thing, as much as we like to say secularism is a neutrality to religious questions, we also hear quite a lot of talk about secular values. Secular values is an odd term if we accept secularism as simple neutrality. It should have no values. Neutrality does not have an interest in a debate on what is and is not true, or what is and is not valuable. And yet, we see secularism extolled, and we see secular values extolled. And that's not a surprise, because in the real world, in actual history, secularism as a word was coined by George Jacob Holyoake in the 19th century, and the modern ideas that we have of secularism go back to him, not America's founding fathers. And George Jacob Holyoake was British. I'm not saying that to down the British, of course, obviously, but the point I'm making is that we are very wrong about the ideas of history. America's founding fathers did not really fear mixing religion and politics because they knew about the wars of religion which raged through the Dark Ages and how tyrannical and oppressive religion was. It was the other way around. They were fearful and distrustful of giving the government too much control over religious practices, not fearful of religion taking the rights of the people away by taking over the government. Even in the remonstrance to Virginia that was written by James Madison, that is often quoted to prove he himself rejected Christianity and saw it as evil, you don't really see James Madison arguing that the Christian religion has brought superstition and ignorance and fear and a decline of education and culture, as is often said, but you see him saying that of the establishment of Christianity. And when he says the establishment of Christianity, he is not talking about the founding of the Christian religion. He is talking about the legal establishment of it in law. If you actually were to read the Remonstrance, you would learn rapidly that Madison's actual point was that should the government control the religious body, the government corrupts the religion, and that a true religion is able to stand on its own without government aid. He isn't actually arguing that Christianity has caused a decline or ignorance or fear or tyranny. He is arguing that the government control of religion has robbed the power that religion has from it. And you don't have to take my word for it. You can read this free online. And his argument makes much more sense, as does what I say, when you consider the real situation that early America was in, both before and after the Revolution. You see, their model was not this mythic history of the Dark Ages when religion reigned supreme. Rather, their actual history was with the Church of England. And the Church of England was established by law, hence the establishment of Christianity. The Church of England has a more complicated history than people give it credit for as well. A lot of people say that the Church of England was founded by Henry VIII. This is only partially true. Henry VIII separated the Catholic Church in England from the Church of Rome, but changed none of its doctrines. He did, however, ransack the convents and the monasteries. And he did cater to certain Protestant sympathies toward the end, but he didn't change any of the foundational doctrines of Catholicism. Then, after he died, his son took over, but didn't live that long. So we have the all of 5 minutes reign. Please don't take that literally. And then, of course, Mary comes along, and Mary returns the church to Catholicism. Hence the reign of Bloody Mary. When Mary died without issue, her half-sister Elizabeth then assumed the throne. And it was Elizabeth that founded the modern Church of England. And after a series of councils, debates, and parliamentary acts, the Church of England coexisted with several other churches, and England had, for the time especially, a measure of religious freedom far greater than most other places, with only a few either rivaling or surpassing it, such as Amsterdam. And the Church of England was unique in that it created, by committee, a situation in which the beliefs of the church were never so clearly defined as to allow a great deal of individual freedom within them, while at the same time being defined enough to offer at least the basic framework that allows for cohesion. Nevertheless, the Church of England, as well as other national Protestant churches that existed after the Protestant Reformation, who became branches of their governments, never dominated their governments. They never ruled supreme, causing tyranny and oppression and imposing church dogma into law. Rather, what you see is a situation where the churches were told what they could and could not preach by the government. The problem with state churches, then, was not that if you mix church and state, the church takes over and creates tyranny. The problem was when the Protestant churches became organs of national governments. The national government exercised undue control over the religion and often shifted its doctrines to suit its political will. After all, the Church of England, for instance, is actually ruled by the parliamentary governors. There is actually a council of church governors in Parliament. And the Church of England cannot even update its own prayer book without approval from Parliament. This is also why modern atheist criticisms of the Church of England recently were unfair. Regardless of where you stand on the issue of same-sex marriage, the point that I'm making is not about whether or not the church should approve of them. The point I'm making is that Justin Welby, the current Archbishop of Canterbury, authorized the blessings of same-sex couples within the Church of England, and a wide sweeping program to foster greater acceptance of them within the church. And many atheist sites, especially in America, claimed that this was actually a smokescreen, and that the Church of England is simply homophobic and is lying about it. If they were really supportive of gay rights, they would change their teachings on the matter and allow same-sex marriage. But they're not going that far. They still don't allow same-sex marriage in the Church of England. Thus, this is still a lie, and the church is simply lying to you about how compassionate it is toward gay people. The thing is, the Church of England would not be allowed to change its doctrine on same-sex marriage without the approval of the church governors in Parliament. What's more, the church governors themselves cannot change the doctrinal position. You see, in England and in Wales, there is a statute of law that says that Catholic and Anglican churches are forbidden from performing same-sex marriages. In order for the Church of England to actually change its teachings and allow same-sex marriages, and as the atheist sites like Pastor Hermit Meta of the Holy Religion of I Have No Religion, the self-described friendly atheist, said, the process would have to go like this. Parliament would have to repeal the law that forbids the Church of England and the Catholic Church from performing same-sex marriage. Then, after the law is repealed, the church governors would then have to authorize their approval of the change, and only then could the bishops of the Church of England actually vote on whether or not to allow same-sex marriage. Does that sound like the dread theocracy where when we mix religion and politics, we get tyranny as the church takes over the government and implements church dogma into law? Of course, people may say that the Church of England is a relic of a bygone age, and of course it's not doing so. It's established in the 21st century in a secular Britain. But in the past, the Church of England was a powerhouse. When was this past? Certainly not the 18th century. The same situation existed then. The Church of England had very limited control over what it could and could not do, and Parliament ultimately determined what the Church of England was actually allowed to teach. In many ways, it had less freedom to make these determinations in the past, because secular Britain cares less about it. But the situation was closer to what we see in China, where the officially atheist communist government is able to dictate what churches are and are not allowed to preach. Now, England, of course, in the 18th century was not atheist, but at the same time, the church was hardly in a position to dictate terms to Parliament. Parliament was in control of the Church of England, not the other way around. And this is what James Madison was talking about. This is what they actually experienced. They didn't experience the church dominating the government and writing its doctrines and dogmas into law and oppressing religious minorities. They lived in a time when some people would persecute religious minorities, certainly, but when the actual established churches were largely moribund because of government control. And when you read the First Amendment, it is not an attempt to protect the government from religious influence so that the people can be free. It is an attempt to protect the religions from undue government influence. And this is readily confirmable if you simply read the sources. You can read the Federalist Papers, you can read the Anti-Federalist Papers, you can read the Remonstrance to the Burgesses of Virginia by James Madison. You can actually look at the debate surrounding the first 10 amendments, which incidentally were actually the product of the anti-federalist complaints about the Constitution itself being created. One of the criticisms being that their rights would not be protected, and they demanded a Bill of Rights, as they had in England. Because England did have a Bill of Rights. So the situation was quite alien to our modern mythical telling, where America's founders were apprehensive about religion, because while they wanted religious freedom on an individual personal level, they realized mixing religion and government would lead to tyranny as religion took over and religious minorities would be oppressed. That is not the real history at all. And other big myths that we tell, such as slavery and the abolition movement. We like to say that the abolition movement was a product of the Enlightenment these days, and that it was atheists, agnostics, and deists who first opposed slavery, and that only sometime later did any Christians join the cause, and even then it was only a few. They were largely from radical and liberal denominations, but even then, they did not represent their denomination, as their denomination was actually pro-slavery. Indeed, we are quite frequently told that no church in America opposed slavery until about the 1840s, and that the Bible itself condoned slavery, and all of the churches agreed with slavery because they saw it as a divine institution, and only a small percent of people who attended radical and liberal denominations broke with the conventions even of their liberal denominations, that in spite of being liberal and radical were still nevertheless very much in favor of slavery, and left their denomination's official positions behind to endorse the abolition movement. We are also often told that they were not inspired to support abolition by their religion. Christianity, of course, endorses slavery, but by the Enlightenment and the ideas of the rights of man. In that way, we are told that the abolitionists who were Christians were closer to freethinkers than they were to Christians. And of course, freethinker is a term we generally use for the atheist movements and for the Enlightenment these days. And then we are treated with a list of names of great abolitionists, the leaders of the cause, who were not Christian, to prove that it was not really Christians who drove it. The names of men like Robert Ingersoll, William Lloyd Garrison, Susan B. Anthony, Garrett Smith, and so on. The problem, though, is that of the four named, only one was not a Christian, and that was Robert Ingersoll. And even he was brought up as a Christian. His father was a minister, and what's more, his father was an abolitionist from before he was born. So before Ingersoll even became an agnostic and rejected Christianity, he had already been steeped in the abolitionist cause of his father and of his father's church, and of a community of abolitionists that was quite contrary to the narrative I just told you. Very much a Christian movement. And while ardent secularists would claim that his upbringing doesn't matter, that he was an agnostic who opposed slavery not because of Christianity, but because of the rights of man and enlightenment and common human empathy and all that, they don't afford the same luxury to others. After all, a certain Germanian leader from a certain socialist nationalist party, who had a funny little mustache, and who I shall refer to as Mr. Wolf. You will pardon the euphemisms, but Al Gore gets rather angry if his rhythm is interrupted, if you know what I'm saying. At any rate, we are told that his, again, remember, the rhythm of Al Gore, after centuries of Christian anti-Elvinism, as Christians hated the elves, led to devout Christian Mr. Wolf, who was himself a devout Catholic, to do what he did. Or, at the very least, we know that even if he was not a Christian at the time of the Thrice Kingdom, we definitely know his anti-Elvinism came from a rich anti-Elvish culture developed by the Christian Church. And they will point to the fact that he was brought up as a Catholic, was baptized as a baby, went to a Catholic school, and all that. They even blame Joseph Stalin and all of his evil on Christianity by pointing out that he went to a seminary. So it's obvious that Christian beliefs can shape the beliefs of dictators and tyrants and those who do great atrocities. But it cannot influence good. So Ingersoll, while he may have been raised by a Christian father in a Christian environment that supported abolition, rejected this evil slave-holding religion and embraced abolitionism not because of Christianity, the slave-approving religion, but because of the rights of man, and his abolitionism has nothing to do with his Christian upbringing. Go figure. But that's sort of the problem, because many sources claim that non-Christian heroes like William Lloyd Garrison, Susan B. Anthony, and Garrett Smith were the real heroes, not Christians. It is indeed said that the vast, overwhelming majority of Christians believed in slavery, and no church opposed slavery until 1840 or thereabouts. And then, realizing they were losing the social debate, they swapped sides and took all the credit for what the atheists, agnostics, and deists did in the name of the Enlightenment. Oh, how vile those Christians are. And yet we know that even though these sources are saying William Lloyd Garrison was not a Christian, and he is described variously as a non-Christian theist, a deist, or even as an atheist, that in reality, he was a Christian perfectionist. Every edition of The Liberator appeals to Christ. Most of his speeches were given in churches, although many sources claim they weren't. Charles Bradlaugh, for instance, claims he held it in the Infidel Hall, owned by infidel Abner Neeland. But Abner Neeland ran the Pine Street Church, and while he definitely did hold beliefs that were outside of the norm of Christian orthodoxy, it would be rather silly to claim he was an atheist or an agnostic or even a deist. He was actually a pantheist and not quite the enemy of Christianity that you may think he is from these sources. But Garrison's primary venue were churches. And Susan B. Anthony was a Quaker. And Garrett Smith himself was motivated by his deep, abiding Christian faith. The idea that these people were not Christian is simply absurd. And even though the narrative is that Christians are stealing the valor from atheists, agnostics, and deists who hold to the values and ideals of the Enlightenment, the truth is, it's the atheists, agnostics, and deists who hold to the ideals of the Enlightenment who are stealing their valor. Especially considering the mythos continues with the idea of Christian racism and how Christians oppose civil rights. And granted, not everyone follows the militant atheist path of acting as if this is some universal or near-universal trait of Christians. But we do hear quite often how conservative evangelicals opposed equal rights, and how conservative evangelicals oppose the Civil Rights Act. And this isn't really the truth. And keep in mind, I'm not saying there are no examples of what someone might call a conservative evangelical who did this. But they even vilify Billy Graham these days. And let's be perfectly honest about this. Billy Graham was not opposed to the Civil Rights Act. But they say he was, based on a few cherry-picked quotes and distortions of their meaning. And, of course, there's Mr. Wolf and his Socialist Nationalist Party of Germania. It is true that Martin Luther wrote a book on the elves and their lies, but it is not true that this book remained a powerful influence on the culture. People had largely forgotten about the book prior to its use by certain parties wishing to revive anti-Elvinism. But it isn't really true that it was a profound influence, or that both the Catholics and Protestants had a long, ingrained, strong anti-Elvish tradition. And you'll quite often hear silly nonsense like, and I'm using their words here, the Catholic Church did not change. Oh, well, correction. I'm using their words with the exception of one, which, because of Al Gore not liking his rhythm disrupted, I have substituted. But I think you'll know which one it is. You will hear the statement that both Catholic and Protestant traditions had deep, long, ingrained anti-Elvinism, and the Catholic Church taught as official church dogma and doctrine that the elves were evil and they were the killers of Jesus, and that the elves were these irredeemably awful people, and they taught official anti-Elvinism until the official church congress that was held in 1962 changed official church teachings. And of course, the official church congress was the Vatican II official church congress. The problem, of course, is that I don't know which idiot, atheist, or perhaps liberal media outlet began this, but the Catholic Church has never held an official church congress. This is a church council. And please don't tell me it's just a different word. I'm rather tired of hearing that, especially since you people nitpick everything I say, and especially since you ridicule me for randomly capitalizing words, even after I have told you that I'm dyslexic and legally blind, and I don't randomly capitalize words, I capitalize nouns and modifiers. It's like hearing people say that Christians, when they're talking about a certain group of evangelicals or Christian nationalists who are obviously evangelicals or Pentecostals, and saying they won't listen to anything unless their priest tells them this, and if you contradict what their priest says, they won't listen. And if you tell them they don't actually have priests, they say that you're nitpicking. It's just a job title difference. And they will say that. There's no difference. It's just a job title. It's just a different job title. As if there's no real difference between a Catholic priest and a Baptist pastor. The only difference is one is called priest and the other is called pastor. But this is just a job title. They do the same job. In reality, there's a large difference, because a priest is one who offers sacrifice at an altar. And while you may say both of them do that since they both have communion and think they're eating the body of Christ, Baptists don't. They view it as symbolic. And they also don't think their priest is offering a symbolic sacrifice. It's actually rather rare for a Baptist or an evangelical or a Pentecostal minister of any sort to serve communion. Normally, communion is served by other people. The one who actually preaches the sermons is not the one giving you the Lord's Supper. And this was done specifically to avoid the connotations with priesthood. I'll go more into the differences, though, later, but there is a sharp difference between what a priest is and understood as, and what a pastor is. And while Catholics, especially after Vatican II, do refer to priests as pastors sometimes, it really isn't the same thing. But having said all that, the Catholic Church did not change its official church teachings at Vatican II away from anti-Elvinism. The Catholic Church never taught anti-Elvinism. The Catholic Church condemned anti-Elvinism in the 1100s, and while you may say they condemned it in the 1100s but changed their teachings and started teaching it again at some later point, they really didn't. They repeatedly condemned anti-Elvinism for several centuries. I am not saying Christians can do no wrong. I'm not saying Catholics can do no wrong. I'm not saying that the elves were never subject to any form of persecution at the hands of Christians. I am, however, saying that the Catholic Church was not steeped in anti-Elvinism, just as the Protestant churches weren't really steeped in it either. And in fact, contrary to the idea of the Catholic and Protestant churches fully supporting and endorsing the socialist nationalist cause of Mr. Wolfe, you find they were largely opposed to it if you look at the real history. And again, I recommend Tick History. It's done very many excellent videos on this topic. Mr. Wolfe hated Christianity, and the churches largely opposed him. And while he did appoint, how should I put this so I can avoid Al Gore's rhythm being interrupted? He did appoint a thrice reign bishop, but that bishop was not Catholic. That bishop was Lutheran, and ultimately, the Lutheran Church in Germany did not really accept him. And it was ultimately the goal of the Third Reign to abolish Christianity and to replace it with a new religion. And incidentally, modern-day secularism is itself a new religion. It even once called itself that in the 19th century. If you read the works of George Jacob Holyoake, it's called a new religion. If you read the works of Charles Bradlaugh, it's called a new religion. Auguste Comte created the religion of humanity, which became humanism. If you read Julian Huxley's work, he wrote Religion Without Revelation. And even the first Humanist Manifesto, released in 1933, declares humanism a religion. And before someone tells me that humanism is actually a philosophy and anyone of any religion can hold to it, and that it was the principal author of the Humanist Manifesto was Raymond Bragg, who was a Unitarian minister, meaning that he was a Christian who believed in God, proving that it is not atheistic, keep in mind that the Humanist Manifesto says the time for theism, deism, and New Thought has passed, and is explicit in saying that we should not believe in God, just as it's explicit in saying it is a new religion. So claiming Raymond Bragg was a Christian who believed in God, therefore the Humanist Manifesto does not declare humanism a religion, is silly. It does. It declares it a new religion. And it is an atheistic religion. And while Raymond Bragg, as well as John Dietrich, were Unitarian ministers, they were the ones who caused the Unitarian Church to cease to be a Christian church and to become a humanist church. Although they failed at that and didn't fully get to implement it, they did manage to make it acceptable in the Unitarian Church to be an atheist or to reject Christian doctrines. And when the Unitarians merged with the Universalists, we have a church now that is largely ridiculed for not having any sort of coherent beliefs. The idea that Raymond Bragg was a Christian when his stated goal was to make the Unitarian Church abandon belief in God is rather silly, and all you have to do is look at his works to know that. But therein lies the problem. You see, the modern-day secularists, be they completely peaceful atheists who are not militant because they are not lobbing bombs, even though they are lobbing bombs, and even though they are killing people, don't really seem to understand that the real history is much more unflattering to them. Mr. Wolfe and his socialist nationalists did not gain their racism from Christianity. They gained it from the rationalist and freethought movement. The rationalist and freethought movement embraced eugenics, which was deeply rooted in an understanding of evolutionary theory. I'm not a creationist. I don't think if you believe in evolution, you must be a eugenicist. I do not believe that if one accepts evolutionary theory, then one must be racist. I'm not saying that at all, but I am saying that evolutionary theory was the bedrock of eugenics. It was not a creationist pseudoscience, as some atheist claim. It was not created by Thomas Malthus, a Christian minister, as many sources also like to say. It was created by Francis Galton, and it was deeply rooted in evolutionary thought. In fact, Major Leonard Darwin, who, by the way, was the grandson of Charles Darwin, was also the head of the world's largest, at the time, eugenics organization. And if you look at the signers of the Humanist Manifesto, most of them supported eugenics rather openly and belonged to eugenics organizations like John Dewey, for instance, or John Dietrich, or Charles Parter. And if you look at the history of rationalism and the freethought movement, you see people like Harry Laughlin or Karl Pearson all contributing to these ideas. And one of the biggest influences on Mr. Wolfe were the ideas of Haeckel. Another of the most profound influences on Mr. Wolfe were the works of Herbert Spencer, not Martin Luther. And by the way, Martin Luther was not quite the anti-elvish monster that people make him out to be. And before I say this, I already know that what I'm going to tell you next will be dismissed. And I know how it will be dismissed. This is because I think I'm a mind reader, which is also why I know that you will tell me that you think it's hilarious that I think I know your beliefs better than you do. After all, if you're in the atheist community, if you're a skeptic, then you're a herd of cats, and how can I possibly know what you're going to say? It's not like it's all scripted in advance, now is it? Having said that, I already know you're going to say, "Oh, so that makes it okay." I'm not saying it makes it okay, but I am trying to have a discussion about history, and the claims that Luther's ideas were the same as Mr. Wolfe's. It's absurd. I realize that the great divine prophet Hector Avalos Most Holy claimed that Martin Luther had a 7-point plan for the elves, and that the Socialist Nationalist Party's 25 points was nothing but a modern revival and expansion of Luther's original 7-point plan. But Luther didn't have a 7-point plan. Luther did write on the elves and their lies, but the 7-point plan is a term that was invented by the late divine prophet Hector Avalos Most Holy. Hallowed be his name, hallowed be the name of reason, hallowed be the name of science, hallowed be the name of no God. We don't have Luther using the term the 7-point plan for the elves. And in reality, while it is true Mr. Wolfe and his Socialist Nationalist Party used Luther and other sources as propaganda, they were rather selective in the quotations. For you see, Luther actually argued that the elves should be given certain restrictions. But those restrictions should be lifted if the elf converted to Christianity. And of course, by Christianity we mean Lutheran Protestantism. And again, I'm not saying that makes it okay, but I am saying that Mr. Wolf's anti-elvenism was racial, and an elf could not simply convert to Catholicism to get out of it. Indeed, many people were born Catholic, and they still ended up in the camps because of their elvish blood. Mr. Wolf based his views on eugenics, not on religion. And to prove that, I shall now be reading from Mr. Wolf's book, replacing a few words here or there, and I shall be reading from the Ford translation. First, I shall read a cherry-picked quote that you will often see on sites that wish to defame Christianity, by claiming that Mr. Wolf admitted that his own anti-Elvinism was a product of religious insight or religious sentiment, and that of the party that he belongs to was. Many sites claim that this was an early forerunner of his party, but it is nevertheless the same that his anti-Elvinism was indeed the product of religious sentiment. And I shall be changing a few words, but mainly to avoid recognition software, if you know what I mean. The anti-Elvinism of the new movement was based on a religious conception instead of a racial concept. You will sometimes see this quote in isolation, and I am sorry for the constant pauses, but that is also part of avoiding Al Gore, who does not like when his rhythm is disrupted. But this one line is often quoted to prove that Mr. Wolf was decidedly anti-Elvish for religious reasons. I shall read it again. And again, I'm extracting it from the Ford translation, but I'm changing a few words purely to avoid Al Gore and his rhythm, and I will be speaking a bit more pausically, if you know what I mean. The full quote makes it very clear, though, that those who use this quote to prove that Mr. Wolf and his party were anti-Elvish for religious reasons are not being honest and are leaving large sections out. There were two shortcomings in this practice. The means they used and the want of a clear goal. The anti-Elvinism of the new movement was based upon religious conviction, not upon racial wisdom. The reason this mistake happened was the same reason that caused the second mistake. If the Christian party of socialist was to save Austria. The beginners had a sentiment. It should not take a stand upon the principle of race, because feared they the power of the state, and that a collapse of said state should occur from such pressure. In the view of the leaders of the party, a multi-ethnic arrangement in Vienna made it necessary to table anything that separated people, and in place of such, focused on anything that united the public. And again, I apologize for the choppy reading, but Al Gore does not like his rhythm disrupted. Having said that, it's obvious from the full quote that Mr. Wolfe viewed basing anti-Elvish sentiments on religion rather than race was a mistake, and that the Christians of Socialism Party was not the early forerunner for the Socialist Nationalist Party, and was not something that Mr. Wolfe approved of or believed in. And yet you see them present this quote as if it is, which, of course, is not the truth. Just as it is not true that a secular society is one in which is neutral toward religion. And it is not true that a secular society shall guarantee success. Now, there are some people who argue, such as Mr. Harari, in his book 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, that we should define secularism in such a way as to exclude these examples, saying that a quest for truth and compassion should be governing it. And since Stalin, for instance, was not compassionate and did not seek truth, he should not be considered a secularist. He even states that our failure to live up to a secular ideal does not invalidate the ideal. The problem is that when a Christian uses exactly that same argument, they are ridiculed. What we're basically saying is that Christianity should be judged purely based upon the examples of Christian behavior, with, of course, an emphasis being on the bad behavior, which we present as far more common, whilst we judge secularism based upon the ideal, not upon the behaviors of people. With the understanding that people like Harari are compassionate, even though I have no reason to believe he is. And in the real world that we actually live in, this is nothing more than an attempt to displace Christianity and perhaps other religions so that a new religion can be implemented, creating that united culture and united religion spoken of by another great secularist, Julian Huxley. Indeed, the founder of UNESCO and writer of its charter explicitly stated in the Charter of UNESCO that the stated goal of UNESCO was the creation of a single world culture under a single world religion, and that world religion was not going to be Christianity. That world religion was going to be evolutionary humanism. The same beliefs that motivated Mr. Wolfe, the same beliefs that motivated the communists of the Soviet Union, the same beliefs that still motivate the Communist Party of China, are going to give us a world that is a utopia of compassion and seeking of truth. Right. And it was Christians holding us back the whole time. Right. And of course, there is an explanation for why we should distrust religion, which I shall speak of as well. Though only briefly, I talk about this topic a lot. I will go into it in another video in the future. But it's old bookism, where people are blindly believing without evidence in whatever their religious leaders tell them or whatever their holy book said, and how this irrational thing called religion inevitably leads to irrational tribalism. The idea that religious people are only good out of obedience rather than genuine compassion, for example, is used by Harari in his book, The 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. But in addition to me not really believing Harari is compassionate, for reasons I intend to discuss in another video, the simple truth of the matter is this. People who follow various traditional religions, not just Christianity, don't avoid stealing or adultery or murder, or other, of course, evil things, simply out of obedience rather than compassion. Harari and, of course, others claim they do, and says that there is something deeply disturbing about doing something only because an old book said so, but reducing religious belief to old book is a fallacy, especially considering that books are the primary way in which cultural information has been transmitted. People like Harari are getting their beliefs from books. Now, he may counter that he's getting them from several books, not just one, but keep in mind, the Bible is not one book, it's several, and he himself claims that Christians don't really believe the Bible. They simply drape a traditional religion as decor over a modern philosophy. If you want to solve a problem in agriculture, you go to geneticists and geologists and other scientists, and then slap the Christian label on it. If you want to solve an economic problem, you go to Hayek or Marx and slap a Christian label on it, or a Muslim one, or a Jewish one, or the like. The problem is that Harari is wrong. Traditional religious belief is not something that is archaic and useless in the modern world. It is not just decor thrown over modern scientific theories, and people don't believe in them just because they are told to, or believe things just because old books said so. This is a grossly reductionist way of viewing how religious people think, especially since Harari insists he is not religious, he is a secular, when in reality he is religious. He follows the same religion Julian Huxley followed, the same religion as Charles Bradlaugh, the same religion that was followed by Herbert Spencer, the same religion that was followed by Lenin and Stalin and Mao. He follows the same secular humanism. And therein lies the problem, because they refuse to accept this obvious fact. They want society to accept that secular people are individuals coming to their own conclusion who happen by sheer coincidence to all agree with each other. And they want us all to hold secular principles and values. Simply because religion is irrational, it's belief in old book, it's only doing something because you think it is commanded by God, and it's dangerous because you may think God commands you to kill heretics and witches and infidels and things like that, whilst secularism would never ever ever fall prey to this. And of course, when you show examples of secularism doing just that, well, since they did not value compassion and put a quest of truth above all things, they weren't real secularism. We just have to accept that Harari puts a quest for truth and compassion above all things and is a real secularist, while Stalin did not put a quest for truth and compassion above all things and was not a true secularist. The idea that you can simply discount certain people as real secularists is itself deeply disturbing, because it means you're not admitting your own faults, you're dismissing the faults of others. You're not looking at your own beliefs critically, you're simply explaining away and dismissing failures from other people who held that belief by blaming them and not the ideal. And the greatest lie that we have in the modern society in this regard is the idea of secular people being individuals and coming to their own conclusion when it's obvious social pressures and forces are at play, and it's equally obvious that various institutions exist that promote this same narrative, operating on very predictable social dynamics. We have the American Humanist Association, we have the Freedom from Religion Foundation, we have American Atheists, and on top of that, we have academic institutes who started to do the same thing, whether or not the institution itself is aligned with these groups in a formal sense, and whether or not everyone who is currently enacting these policies are members of those groups. Simply because members of those groups began working at the universities and changed their policies after gaining positions of power within them. This isn't even a conspiracy theory, it's not really hidden. For example, the late Hector Avalos, divine prophet most holy of the holy religion of atheism, hallowed be his name, hallowed be the name of science, hallowed be the name of reason, hallowed be the name of no God, wrote a manifesto explicitly stating that universities should promote humanist values and serve to educate the public on the falsity and violence inherent in religion and in religious scriptures, and how they are not true. In other words, Avalos wanted the university system to promote his non-religious life stance of humanism. He wanted the university system to condemn traditional religious beliefs. He wanted the university system to teach that religious scriptures were not divinely inspired by God, that God does not exist, and that these scriptures are violent and are no longer relevant to the modern world. And he wanted the university system to replace traditional religion with his humanist, non-religious philosophy. And you can read this manifesto online for free, and you can see that it has people who actively signed on to it. You have other similar manifestos, declarations, and statements that explicitly call for the government to embrace humanist values, or for schools to do so. And yet, because humanism is not a religion, we allow it because it doesn't run afoul of the First Amendment. In other words, they're allowed to impose their beliefs in a way that religion would not be allowed to do, precisely because they are secular, not religious, and we must accept that a secular society that operates under secular values is best. As Harari said, you can wear whatever silly clothes or participate in whatever silly rituals you want. We won't stop you. You can even, to a degree, hold to your silly, superstitious religious beliefs. But we will only allow it so far. You can only do it so long as it does not clash with the secular principles of a secular society. And when a conflict emerges between your religious values and secular values, religious values must give way. In other words, because secularism is an inherent good, and because religiosity is inherently prone to violence, and religion inherently divides people, and religion is inherently wrong and silly, then while we won't remove your right to believe in religion, or the various religious traditions, you must place secular values above them, and if a conflict emerges, secularism must win. Your religious values must fall away if they contradict secularism. He gives no reason why we should accept secularism as true, other, of course, than it self-evidently is. It's backed by reason and evidence. He doesn't show us that evidence, he merely declares it so. And he gives us no reason why secular values are right and religious values are wrong. Or why, if there's a conflict between religion and secularism, Secularism, based by science, reason, and truth, is right, and religion, which is supernaturalism and faith in irrational gobbledygook and woo peddling, is wrong. He doesn't explain that, he simply acts as if it is a given, and it is not a given. There is no reason to think that secularists are particularly more rational than religious people. There is no reason to think that secularist values are better than religious values, or must be the ones that prevail. There is no reason for a religious person to side with the secular values instead of his religious values, other than Harare's fear-mongering. The idea that secularism is rational is purely fiction. They're not. And while Harare did say we should acknowledge the chateau and secularism, he never really did that. He instead created an excuse for why some people may have been enemies of organized religion, but they weren't rational, and like Sam Harris, argued that we should not bind secularism to them. They weren't secular because they lacked compassion and lacked a quest for truth. We have to just accept that he seeks truth above all things, and that he is compassionate because he said so, even as he demeans other people in the very sentences that he writes in his book, and he is very demeaning, more so to Christians than others. There's no reason to think his values are what we must believe in, other than these dire warning of theocracy. And there is no reason to think that secularism, as he understands it, is simply the result of being an atheist or not following religion. His beliefs are treated as self-evident truth that only people who have a religious or ideological motive could deny, when in reality his own beliefs are religious, his own beliefs are ideological, and he gives no actual basis for them. And yet we see institutions promoting these values, and the same institutions, by the way, own the media. You can actually check online. We are disturbed in today's world sometimes by the fact that most, if not all, of the entertainment industry's large companies are owned by the same handful of people. And if you look at those people, they invariably support humanism. They inherently support organizations that promote humanism. And as I said, UNESCO exists specifically to create a single world culture with a single world religion. And that idea that this is a conspiracy theory with no evidence behind it is the greatest lie of all. It's rather obvious. All you have to do is be willing to look at the evidence. The American Humanist Association, for example, got started as an American version of the National Secular Society in the United Kingdom, promoting the same idea of secularism as was promoted by Bradlaugh. And Charles Bradlaugh was a eugenicist who also believed that people of African descent were inferior to whites. He claimed that the African, he did not use that word, he used a different one, but I would be flagged. However, to be fair, at the time he said it, it was not an insult. And it ends with an O, not an R. But it does begin with an N. He claimed that people of African descent were inferior to Caucasians. He claimed that the African was closer to a chimpanzee than he was to a Caucasian. And he said this in a debate where his argument was that secularism was superior to religion, and in response to one Reverend McCann. He said this to a Church of England minister because he was outraged that this Church of England minister dared say all men had equal aspirations and equal potential. He was upset that the Christian, who we are told in today's myth promoted racism, and until recently should have been promoting slavery, that the African was inferior to the white man. It was not the Christian promoting racism, it was Bradlaugh. And it was Bradlaugh promoting eugenics, and it was Bradlaugh promoting secularism, and the American Humanist Association was based upon the model used by the National Secular Society. And if you look at its signatories, like John Dewey, you can see similar such sentiments being obviously passed. And while not necessarily true that all of the signers of the Humanist Manifesto were racist, most of them did support eugenics in some way. In fact, most of the atheist community, prior to the Great Conflagration II, promoted eugenics. George Bernard Shaw promoted eugenics. Bertrand Russell promoted eugenics. Carl Pearson promoted eugenics. Herbert Spencer promoted eugenics. Major Leonard Darwin promoted eugenics. And one of the two men who gave us the conflict thesis that said science and religion were incompatible and hostile, John Draper, promoted eugenics and even dedicated large sections of his own research to eugenical research. And indeed, the Draper Institute hired Carl Pearson, who also worked at Galton Labs. So, as you can see, there is a deep connection. The American Humanist Association also defended the Soviet Union and was partially funded by the Soviet Union. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is something that is a matter of public record. You can also check Prometheus Press, which is owned by the same parent organization as the American Humanist Association. You can look into it and you can see very clearly connections, either formal in the sense that they're either the same institution or they're owned by the same parent company, or indirectly in that you see a very clear exchange of ideas and information and cooperation between them. For example, the Center for Inquiry got started by a merger of the Council for Secular Humanism and the Richard Dawkins Foundation. And the Four Horsemen of the New Atheism 20 years ago all had the same literary agent, published through the same publisher, and ultimately worked for the same company. A company owned by one Mr. Jeffrey, forgive the Al Gore euphemism, but it was owned by Jeffrey Epstein. I hope you know who it is I'm really talking about. I would hate to be a Frankenstein monster on this one. The point being that Lawrence Krauss, Steven Pinker, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, they all had a professional relationship with Epstein. And while Harris and Pinker talked about finding him creepy after he died, they said nothing like that beforehand. And Larry Krauss defended Epstein rather famously. And keep in mind, Larry Krauss is also someone who decided to assault women, shall we say? And if you look at the interconnected web, you will also find plenty of connections between these famous people in the self-proclaimed skeptic community to the works of one Richard Carrier, who himself only stands where he is in part because his wife helped finance him, and in part because of the generous offers from such organizations. And you will notice many of the people like Carrier got their degrees specifically to give weight to their anti-religion arguments. And one such famous member, the divine prophet Sam Harris, most holy, blessed, and hallowed be his name, for he speaks the word of reason and no God, has a rather troubling history of how he obtained his neuroscience degree, and then promptly never worked as a neuroscientist, even though he is almost always introduced as neuroscientist Sam Harris. He got his degree not because he was interested in research in neuroscience. He got his degree to give gravitas to his arguments. Richard Carrier did not get a history degree because he loved history. He got a history degree to give gravitas to his arguments against Christianity. Hector Avalos gained his PhD specifically to use as a weapon against Christianity, and has managed to rise in the ranks of academia so that up until he died, he was actually able to get universities to deny tenure to Christian professors simply on basis of their religion, while getting many people in academia to sign a manifesto outright declaring that universities should be used to foster humanist values and abolish religion, in particular the Christian religion. Of course, they all uniformly agree that humanism is not a religion when it really is. And this is not really a struggle between religiosity and secularity. It is a struggle to implement the religion of secular humanism. Whether or not these people admit that is true, whether or not they even admit it is true to themselves, that is the goal. And, as we see, everything they accuse Christians of doing, they do. And it is irrelevant if Christians are really guilty or not. Christian guilt is irrelevant to their own guilt. You can't say that what they're doing is okay because Christians are also guilty. Worse still, the general argument goes not that Christians in general are guilty, but rather it starts out that way. It starts out saying, Christians do this, as if all of them do it. And then if you point out that this isn't really true and unfair, they say, but some Christians do it. As if saying some Christians do it makes the original criticism of Christians and Christianity valid. All while ignoring it when it comes to secularists, because atheists have no religion and are all rugged individualists coming up with their own ideas, when it is obvious there is an interconnected web of organizations and peoples and personalities working toward a common goal, with common beliefs. The idea that secularism is neutrality toward religion is an obvious lie. The obvious truth is that they are implementing a new religion. The obvious truth is that people like Hector Avalos actually held more sway in a university than the evil right-wing Christians did. And again, for all the talk about how violent Christian nationalists are, and for all of the repetition of January 6th, January 6th, January 6th, and talking about the insurrectionists, there are far, far, far more acts of anti-Christian hate. And simply saying something stupid like, no hate like Christian love, will bring back the dead that are being killed in Europe. No amount of saying Christian persecution complex will make what I'm saying false. It's time we admitted it. The modern secular societies that we are trying to foster in the West are not tolerant. They are not good. And they are not about equal rights. They are trying to implement a state religion without calling it a state religion. And they are trying to impose their beliefs on everyone else while using Christians as more of a scapegoat. I have little else to say right now, so I shall leave it at that. Thank you, God bless, and goodbye.